Hey there, Nico here from Zambezi Flora. Today I'm just about to start off on a trip that will see me going up to northeastern Zambia to a place called the Mafinga Hills or the Mafinga Mountains. It's one of the spots in Zambia that it rises above 2,000 meters, of which there are not too many in Zambia, and it is also an area that is less botanically explored. It's going to be a long trip. It's going to take at least 2 days to get there due to the roads and stuff like that here. And then from there, we're going to be having to hike to our campsite and everything like that. But so basically, we're starting out from here in Lusaka and then having to drive all the way up as we get to Isoka up here, and then still off that main road, driving off just to the edge right here. So the Mafinga Hills are shared between Zambia and Malawi. This is an old geographical map, but it serves the purpose of what I need to do. So yeah, this is going to be one hell of a trip. I'm looking forward to it. There's a little trepidation as well, but hey, it wouldn't be fun if it wasn't somewhat interesting along the way. So hope you enjoy our trip. Cheers. So I'm back in Lusaka. It dawned on me very quickly that I was not going to be able to be a botanist, be a videographer, and be a presenter all in one during the trip. And so I was there to do the botany, so I stuck to doing the botany and did filming and photographing and stuff like that, sparsely. And we'll kind of cobble together a video based on that with being here in Lusaka and explaining it. And so my original concept of how I wanted these videos to go had to be rethought on the go. That said, so this first part, I kind of want to talk about just the logistics of getting to the Mafinga Mountains. As I kind of pointed out in the previous video on the day that I left Lusaka, it's a little over 1,000 kilometers from Lusaka through up to the Mafinga Hills, Mafinga Mountains, sorry. But the state of Zambia's roads is not always the greatest. There are areas of roads that are in really good shape and you can easily travel, 100 or so kilometers an hour and get past them very quickly. Then there are areas that are less ideal, with maybe a few potholes here and there, or where the asphalt is degrading, but not too badly, and you can easily still travel at decent distance. But there are then sections where the asphalt is degrading quite badly. You have large potholes that have opened up and slowed down your transit quite considerably, where you might average about 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. And finally, there are areas of the main roads, and I'm just talking main roads here, where the asphalt might have disappeared altogether due to various issues, but usually it has to do with our weather and drainage patterns and things along those lines. And in those scenarios, you have it where the asphalt will have disappeared altogether, and you get large kind of ruts forming in the on the road at that point in time that are quite dangerous, both for vehicles and for large trucks. And the Great North Road, which we took to get up to the Mafingas, is part of the Great North Road system here in Zambia. And we're seeing more and more large trucks coming from Tanzania, bringing in things like fuel and other goods, as well as materials, and traveling back that road towards Tanzania to bring out, copper and things along those kinds of lines. So it's a very important economic route in Zambia that is in need of definitely some attention in certain places as well. So that's the main road. Then when you get off the main road, you can be on secondary roads and village roads, and those are even usually less maintained by comparison to the main road. These are small feeder roads into smaller towns and or districts, and then villages that are even further away from these areas. The maintenance of these usually can fall on the local councils and or local communities, depending on where they are. And sometimes they can be fantastic, sometimes they can be really tough. When we're driving into the hills, especially in some of the higher rainfall areas of Zambia, there is always the greater possibility of road washouts. And we were very lucky that we didn't come across any of these areas where the roads had washed out. That said, we did come across quite a few areas on the main road this is as well, where you had trucks either flipping over or breaking down. And the breaking down is not so bad, but you have these situations where trucks might pull off to the side of the road and then not realize that the side of the road is not as stable as they might think, so the actual truck just tips over. Or in other extreme cases where the trucks have hit a pothole or hit a bad patch of road, where then it essentially causes the truck to flip on its side. And these can be quite bad because they can block the road and reduce the flow of traffic. So on our way up, we came across about 7 or 8 of these trucks lying on their sides. But so the roads themselves can be quite difficult to transverse. So it took us about 3 days to get to the base of the mountains. We overnighted at the base because we arrived there in the afternoon, having paid courtesy calls to the district commissioner of Mafinga district, as well as the chief for the area. And these are just things that we do in Zambia just to allow people to know why we are there and what we are doing effectively. So we arrived at the villages where we left the vehicle on the afternoon of the 3rd day and set up camp because obviously hiking into the hills, we knew it was going to take time, but we just didn't quite know how long it was going to be. And for the porters that were going to return on after bringing us our stuff into the mountains, they needed daylight to be able to return. So we overnighted in the village at the base of the mountains, and then set out the next morning. So it's just after 7. The next morning, slept fairly well. A little chilly, but other than that, it was a pleasant evening. It's a little later than we'd wanted. We'd wanted to be off fairly easy, but breaking down camp took a bit. So as you can see, it's overcast. I'm not sure what kind of weather we're going to get. So I'm probably going to put most of this equipment away and just clamber up the mountain. You know, I don't know really what I expected the climb to be, but it was a lot harder than my expectations, and I probably should have been smarter about that and realized that this was not going to be a cakewalk, effectively. That said, there were a nice gradual incline initially from where we camped, and we camped at about 1,500 meters above sea level, and gradually rose as we walked through the foothills up to about 1,700 meters before we really hit the inclines. And in some of these areas, we were climbing at a slope of maybe about 60 to 70 degrees upwards. So not an easy one to sustain for long periods, but then you're also making that distance over maybe, 200 or 300 meters, which at that slope is really tough on the legs. I took quite a bit of time in terms of getting up because my legs were starting to cramp with some of these inclines, especially as the day wore on and you're still climbing. The cramping builds much faster, so we'd have to pace ourselves and take it along those lines. But every now and then when you would stop, you would at least be able to enjoy the scenery and the beauty of the location, and obviously being on the botany side, taking in the plants as we were going along. We passed through Miombo woodland at the base of the mountains. And then as you continue to climb up, you either pass through drainage areas where you might have riverine vegetation along those lines, but nothing too big, no real closed forests, usually towards the base as much. And then once you hit a certain level on the incline, you start to get into much more rocky areas where we were getting kind of what Dennis Fanshawe back in the day called montane scrub, and then into montane grassland. And these are vastly different than the woodland that we came through, where most taller plants are xerophytic species that can deal with lower water needs, and that rarely grow more than maybe 2 meters tall. Once we kind of got up there, there weren't too many areas of proper woodland trees that would get too tall. So as we crested the first ridge of the mountains on our way to the campsite, we were climbing just about 2,200 meters up, and keeping in mind that about the maximum height of the Mafingas on the Zambian side, at least, is 2,340 or so meters above sea level. So at that point in time, we'd gotten into the montane grasslands and montane scrub areas, and then descended again through that into some upland woodland at this point in time, still remnants of miombo with the uapaka species, which can form fairly dense stands, and then transited down into a ravine to then pop back up the ravine. And these, again, were a descent and a climb of, slopes of 70 or so percent down right into the ravine. So they're quite steep in that regard, before making it to our camp in a Afro-montane forest, riverine forest setting. And we covered about 15 kilometers on that first day's walk, and that took about 10 hours. My hat's off to the porters who were able to do that hike and probably reached the camping site several hours before we did. But the arrival at camp was a sweet, it was definitely a sweet period in terms of finally having arrived at our location. But then there are the issues of camp and setting yourself up. Unfortunately, the area has not really been used as a campsite before, and it was on an incline. So we had this maybe 10 to 15 degree incline of setting up tents, and being on an incline when sleeping, which was not always the easiest. You start out one night and then wake up in the morning having slid down your tent towards the bottom of it. However, luckily, we really lucked out on the weather side of things. We didn't have too much rain during the trip. When it did rain, it usually tended to rain at night, after we'd said our goodnights and gotten into bed, which was fantastic. The only difference on that one was actually our last day. It started raining in the afternoon and then rained really, really heavily during the night. I was a little worried that I would get flooded out and that my specimens, which I stored in the tent with me during the course of the trip, would be wet and all of that. So luckily my tent held out. I didn't have any such problems. And on our walk out, so we ended up spending 4 full days in camp, in the hills, exploring a few different areas of the Mafingas. And then on the 5th day, we walked out. And we took a slightly different path than we did on the way in, but it wasn't any less difficult in terms of the climb. It was nice to see different areas as we walked out, But as I said, the night before it had rained and it had just stopped early in the morning, but you could see that there was still rain building. As we left camp and started our walk back, when the porters had come back to then take our stuff with us, there was mist heading over a lot of the hills. You could definitely see that rain was still brewing, and it did spit down here and there on us as we walked, but luckily we didn't get drenched on the walk out. But that said, it was still a very difficult walk out, even though we were already starting at a roughly 1,900 meter level. The climb through the hills is not always an easy one, especially when you're walking over some of those really rocky areas with jagged rocks and inclines of 30 to 40%, and legs that are still reeling from the initial walk in, even though we've had days to rest and things like that. But the overall experience was fantastic. Everybody on the trip thoroughly enjoyed it. A number of us look forward to return trip at a different time of year. And initially, we had actually chosen this period of beginning of January because by then, on a regular year, you're well into the rains. They've already started in November into December, and by January, there's a lot more things that have come up in growth. This year, this rainy season has been a very different one in that the rains have kind of started and stopped, and there's been a delay. Even here in Lusaka, we had quite a dry November, December, and that has now changed with January having picked up and delivered quite a bit of rain. But unfortunately, the same thing had kind of happened up in the Mafingas. And we arrived there to find that they had also received much less rain in November and December. And as a result, what was growing and flowering and coming up was probably the vegetation that we would normally see in December had we done that early trip. That said, I'm not disappointed by it. The vegetation that we did see was a great kind of early indicator of what is there. Any future trips we will look at doing at a different time of year and hope that we have a normal rainy season. Most previous trips to the Mafingas for botanical collections have usually tended to occur a little later in the year. There was a trip back in 2018 and then another in 2020 that occurred roughly March, April into May, and then Dennis Fanshaw, who did the initial flora of the Mafinga area, I think his trips were also later after the rainy season and things like that. So there is a lot of blanks to fill in when it comes to the floral baseline of the mountains, and it is just very exciting to be able to get up there and to get into the field and to do the work, really. So sore legs aside, I am exceedingly happy that I was able to get up there and be part of this expedition in January, and I definitely look forward to any future ones. So with that, I'm going to conclude this first video, and I think in the next one, we'll talk a little bit more about the vegetation of the Mafingas and what there is to kind of expect in those mountains, and we will kind of take it from there. So stay tuned for part 2. I hope you enjoyed this part, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.